The key operative word is need. All right? No, we do not need Canada.
The United States just told Canada in plain English, we do not need Canada. And this time it wasn't coming from a partisan pundit or an anonymous online voice. It came straight from Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, the very official whose job is to keep the relationship steady. Even more striking, this wasn't the first time Washington delivered that message.
The problem is we don't need their product. You know, we don't need cars made in Canada. We don't need cars made in Mexico.
Only days earlier, President Trump, standing on the floor of a Ford auto plant in Detroit, declared that America doesn't need cars made in Canada, brushing off Canadian autos, lumber, steel, and even energy. Hoekstra's comments didn't appear out of thin air. They reflected a pattern emerging from the top. But the real story isn't the tone, it's the substance. And the substance simply doesn't hold. The suggestion that the U.S. doesn't need Canada isn't just undiplomatic, it's economically false, strategically unworkable, and delivered at a moment when Canada is quietly reshaping its global trade position, while several U.S. industries are feeling the consequences of the Trump administration's tariff-first strategy. And that brings us to what's really at stake as the 2026 USMCA review approaches. During a radio interview in Montreal, Ambassador Hoekstra was asked directly about Trump's dismissive remarks about Canadian products. Rather than recalibrate the rhetoric, he sharpened it. No, we do not need Canada, he said, before explaining that the upcoming USMCA review would determine whether the economic relationship continues as it is or fractures into something entirely different. He also criticized Canadian premiers for taking shots at President Trump while insisting that U.S. officials have shown respect toward Prime Minister Mark Carney. At the same time, Hoekstra hinted at consequences if Canada diverges from U.S. policy. When speaking about Chinese-made electric vehicles, he warned that if Canada opens its market, the United States will not allow Chinese vehicles to flow through Canada into American territory. And all of this happened while Carney was overseas, meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping in a reset of Canada-China trade relations after years of political chill. That timing made Hoekstra's message feel less like commentary and more like a strategic signal.
Let's begin with the foundation of the relationship, energy. The United States cannot operate its refinery system without Canadian heavy crude. According to updated data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, nearly 70% of all U.S. crude imports now come from Canada, averaging between 4 and 4.5 million barrels per day. American refineries, especially those on the Gulf Coast and Midwest, are designed specifically for the characteristics of Canadian heavy oil. They cannot simply switch to U.S. light crude without major redesigns and enormous cost. When Hoekstra says the United States does not need Canada, the statement effectively ignores the physical infrastructure underpinning America's energy stability. U.S. gasoline prices, diesel supply, petrochemical chains all depend on a reliable flow of Canadian heavy crude. This isn't sentiment, it's engineering.
The ambassador's comments also overlook the fact that America's own sectors are struggling with the ripple effects of Washington's policies. Trump's tariff-first approach has increased the cost of steel, aluminum, machinery, and key inputs across North America. Automakers, the very companies Trump aimed to protect, now face rising production costs and supply chain distortions. Farmers have endured another turbulent year after China reduced soybean and grain purchases, forcing Washington to revive emergency subsidy programs. Even U.S. consumer goods companies have been caught in the backlash, as polling shows strong Canadian support for keeping U.S. alcohol off retail shelves, a trend reinforced by tariff tensions. So while Washington insists it does not need Canada, the practical picture shows U.S. businesses absorbing real damage, not Canadian ones, and that contradiction is becoming impossible to ignore. Hoekstra framed the coming USMCA review as a balanced moment of reflection, but the economic leverage tells a different story. Canada has spent the past year quietly increasing its export diversification. Trade flows to Europe and Asia have risen to their highest share in 2 decades, and early 2026 data shows Canada's exports to non-US markets growing faster than at any point since the late 1990s. Meanwhile, Canada continues deepening ties with Asia. Carney's visit to China signals a structured reopening with the world's second-largest economy, covering clean technology, resources, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing. Canada is also accelerating trade links with ASEAN states, building out what Carney has described as a long-term structural diversification. The United States, by contrast, does not have a realistic substitute for Canadian energy, minerals, fertilizers, electricity, aerospace parts, or border logistics. Canada can expand markets. The U.S. cannot easily replace inputs.
I am not aware of the president's team, governors, or the folks that work out of the embassy attacking Mark Carney. We respect him as the leader of Canada. You have folks that just absolutely trash the president, who are in key government officials, and that's a decision they make.
Hoekstra expressed frustration that some Canadian leaders criticized President Trump, yet he avoided acknowledging the president's own dismissive language toward Canadian industries. Every time Trump claims the United States doesn't need Canadian lumber, or cars, or steel, or oil, he reinforces the public belief that Washington is no longer acting in the spirit of partnership. Canadian sentiment has shifted. Surveys show trust in U.S. leadership hitting long-term lows, and economic nationalism has grown stronger across several provinces. Carney's pivot to Asia didn't emerge out of nowhere. It emerged because the political space for it has opened. The ambassador's comments, rather than chastening Canadian leaders, end up confirming why diversification is not only reasonable, but necessary.
Hoekstra insisted the United States welcomes Canada doing business with China, but that statement unraveled the moment he warned that Chinese EVs entering Canada would prompt stricter U.S. border controls. The subtext is clear. Washington is less concerned about China itself and far more concerned about Canada making sovereign decisions that diverge from U.S. preferences. This anxiety surfaces in other areas as well, from Arctic cooperation to joint naval procurement to clean tech supply chains. Canada is no longer behaving as a predictable extension of U.S. economic strategy. It is experimenting with a multipolar identity, one that the U.S. instinctively wants to contain.
The statement, "We do not need Canada," may go down as one of the most consequential diplomatic lines of 2026. It wasn't a misstatement. It was a projection of confidence at a time when U.S. industries are already feeling the strain of aggressive tariffs and realignments. But there is a difference between political messaging and economic reality. The United States needs Canadian crude to keep its refineries running. It needs Canadian components to keep aerospace manufacturing competitive. It needs Canadian fertilizers for agriculture and Canadian electricity in several border regions. And as the USMCA review approaches, it needs a stable northern partner more than ever. The bigger question now is not whether the U.S. needs Canada. It's what happens if Canada finally acts like a country that doesn't need the U.S. and begins structuring its economy accordingly. If that moment arrives, Washington may find the cost of its rhetoric far higher than expected.
And so I really think that the tough days are behind us. We can look forward and we can build a very strong steel sector for Canada. And we need also to have steel in a country for two reasons. First, there's no industrialized country that really doesn't make steel. So it's fundamental for any form of very strong economy to be able to produce steel. And second, if one day Canada is in a conflict, we need to be able to produce steel. That is the sovereign capability we need.
Canada just delivered the line Washington did not expect to hear at this stage of the trade war. According to Industry Minister Melanie Joly, the tough days are behind us. And with that, Canada signaled a turning point in the country's bruising battle with Donald Trump's tariff agenda. The message was not defensive or cautious. It was confident, almost defiant. And it marks the moment where Canada stops absorbing pressure and starts shaping its own industrial future. In a wide-ranging conversation this week, Joly outlined how Canada is emerging from months of steep American tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, copper, and auto-related materials. These tariffs have strained local industries, disrupted export markets, and shaken long-standing assumptions about North American economic integration. Yet instead of waiting for tariff relief or pleading for early sectoral deals, Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear that Canada will not entertain any side agreements before the 2026 CUSMA review. His position carries strategic weight.
If Washington wants concessions, it will have to negotiate them in a full, comprehensive setting rather than extracting piece-by-piece wins. Jolie explained that the federal government is now helping steel communities like Sault Ste. Marie adapt to the new reality. Algoma Steel, battered by months of high tariffs and a closed American market, is retooling to supply the Canadian defense sector and large infrastructure projects. 500 jobs are being restored as part of this shift, and more support for training and workforce recovery is being prepared with the province. But the most striking revelation was Jolie's description of the domestic market. Canada simply did not produce the right types of steel needed for its own shipyards and infrastructure. That gap, she said, is now being closed. Canada intends to manufacture the steel required for its own ships, bridges, transit systems, and housing expansions, rather than relying on foreign markets that can flip overnight.
Well, of course, we're there to support the workers, and we know that the steel sector, for example, doesn't have a business model for that is sustainable like it used to have when exporting to U.S. automakers. So right now what we're doing with the steel sector is we're helping them to adapt and pivot to do the right steel that Canadians need, mainly in the defense sector, mainly for infrastructure and housing.
Trump's tariffs were designed to squeeze Canada into accepting quick deals, to force Ottawa back into alignment with Washington's demands. The assumption was that Canada was too dependent on U.S. buyers to withstand pressure for long. But 2025 showed that Canada has learned from past trade wars. Instead of negotiating from weakness, Carney's government allowed the crisis to reveal exactly which vulnerabilities needed to be fixed. Canada realized it could not continue relying on a single export market for key sectors like steel. The exposure was too great, the political unpredictability too intense, and the economic consequences too immediate. This time, the response was structural rather than tactical. Canada began rebuilding its industries around self-sufficiency, national security, and long-term resilience. Jolie's comments reflect that vision clearly. The country is no longer trying to restore the old model, it is designing a new one. While Trump's strategy was intended to punish Canada, it ultimately pushed Ottawa into a stronger position. As American firms complained about rising input costs and supply chain instability, Canada quietly reorganized its steel sector to serve domestic priorities. What emerged was a shift Washington did not anticipate. Instead of pleading for access, Canada began reducing its need for the U.S. market. This change undermines the leverage Trump expected to use in the 2026 talks. A tariff is only powerful when the other side depends on your market. By redirecting production toward Canadian defense programs, shipbuilding, housing, and infrastructure, Canada is weakening the impact of any future tariff shocks. Mark Carney's refusal to pursue short-term deals is not stubbornness, it is strategy. Sectoral agreements would have absorbed enormous political capital while delivering little long-term stability. The coming renegotiation of USMCA is the true battlefield, and Carney wants Canada negotiating from a position of calm strength rather than economic panic. Every action Canada takes now, from Buy Canada procurement rules to domestic retooling to reskilling programs, builds leverage. It signals that Canada can sustain its industries even under American pressure. And if Canada can sustain itself, then tariffs lose their sting. What Carney is really executing is a long-form demonstration of discipline, a message not only to Washington, but to Canadian industries themselves. By refusing to grab the quick win, he is showing that Canada can think beyond election cycles and respond with nation-scale strategy. This steady posture builds credibility abroad and confidence at home, creating an economic environment where businesses believe Ottawa has a coherent plan rather than a reactive one. In the long run, that patience becomes a competitive asset. Jolie was blunt about the underlying truth. No modern industrial nation can call itself secure if it cannot produce its own steel. Canada needs steel to build ships, repair military equipment, expand infrastructure, and meet housing commitments. For decades, the country imported too much of what it needed or relied on foreign buyers to keep domestic plants alive. Trump's tariff war revealed the danger of that model more clearly than any think tank report ever could. Now, Canada is building a steel industry that serves Canadian interests first. The new plate mills and beam mills are designed specifically for defense, construction, and transportation needs. The jobs being restored in Sault Ste. Marie are not tied to the whims of American automakers. They are tied to Canada's own long-term industrial strategy. Jolie's tone matters. She did not sound defeated or apologetic. She spoke like a minister who believes Canada is regaining control of its economic destiny. In a year marked by global uncertainty, with Trump's protectionism causing ripple effects across North America, Canada's calm, methodical rebuilding stands out. Carney and Jolie are not promising miracles. They are promising stability, the very thing the U.S. has struggled to provide. Canada is presenting itself as a predictable partner in an unpredictable world, and investors are taking notice. If Canada no longer fears tariff shocks, the entire structure of North American bargaining shifts. Trump's leverage weakens. Ottawa has more room to defend its interests, and USMCA 2026 becomes a negotiation between two countries arriving at the table with clearer boundaries and fewer illusions. In the long run, this moment may be remembered as the point when Canada stopped reacting to U.S. economic pressure and started insulating itself from it. Melanie Jolie's declaration that the tough days are behind us is not a line meant to soothe workers. It is a signal that Canada is rewriting its industrial playbook. Steel, once a symbol of how vulnerable Canada was to U.S. policy swings, is now becoming a cornerstone of national resilience. Trump's tariffs may have triggered the crisis, but they also triggered the transformation. And as Canada heads toward the 2026 USMCA review, it does so not as a country seeking relief, but as one preparing to negotiate from strength. The final question is the one Washington should be asking itself. What happens when the tariff weapon no longer works on Canada at all?
We met, and the Prime Minister of Canada, President of Mexico, and we spoke for a half hour. Very good, very productive. Talked mostly trade.
Will you restart negotiations with Canada?
Look, I have a great relationship with Canada. They're very tough traders, but I have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister and with Canada.
But you had said you would halt those negotiations earlier after the tariff.
Well, I have halted them.
And so will you restart them?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, the problem is Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also. But we'll work it out. Look, Canada's a special place, and they really are good at ice hockey, aren't they?
Mr. President.
President Donald Trump didn't need anyone to challenge him. His own words told the story. Asked whether he would restart trade negotiations with Canada, the president simply replied, "We'll see." In that short hesitation lies the truth about the North American landscape in 2025. The United States is improvising its way through a turbulent trade environment, while Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is building stability, direction, and global reach. Tonight, we break down how one casual exchange at the Kennedy Center reveals something far bigger. Canada has a coherent strategy. Trump does not. At the Kennedy Center, Trump spoke about everything from Elton John to UFC fights to Hollywood mergers. The atmosphere was light and off the cuff until someone mentioned Canada. Trump boasted that his meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney had been very productive, but then admitted he had halted trade negotiations. When pressed on whether he would restart talks, his answer was the familiar ambiguity that has defined his second term. "Yeah, we'll see." Then came the line that raised eyebrows across both borders. Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also. Moments later, he shifted to talking about hockey. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, a discussion about the future of continental trade. On the other, a sports joke. The imbalance and seriousness spoke for itself.
And this exchange didn't happen in isolation. It came at a time when Trump's administration is under intense pressure at home, from legal challenges over tariff authority to corporations openly revolting against the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy. In that wider context, Trump's dismissive tone toward Canada sounded less like confidence and more like deflection. It was a reminder that Washington is juggling crises while Ottawa is calmly executing long-term plans.
Trump's non-answer was not a surprise. His trade posture for 2025 has been defined by unpredictability. Tariffs imposed overnight, negotiations frozen without explanation, and the looming threat, reported widely in the international press, that he may withdraw from USMCA in 2026. Canada, meanwhile, has moved in the opposite direction. Under Carney, Ottawa has entered one of its most disciplined phases of economic diplomacy in decades. Instead of waiting for clarity from Washington, Canada has been strengthening ties across Asia and Europe, widening trade channels with South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and the EU, while opening a controlled but pragmatic dialogue with China. Investors read that stability immediately. It is why companies like GM, Volkswagen, Vianode, and even Hyundai increasingly see Canada not as a backup to the U.S., but as a safer long-term base for major industrial operations. What's more, Carney's approach has signaled reliability to allies who are growing weary of Washington's volatility. While Trump shifts positions based on the politics of the moment, Canada has positioned itself as the steady, rules-based partner in a world hungry for predictability. That reputation has become an economic asset in itself, one that attracts capital, talent, and strategic partnerships that the U.S. can no longer take for granted. Trump offers uncertainty, Carney offers a roadmap. That contrast is reshaping how North American power actually works. When Trump dismissed Canadian production as something the U.S. doesn't need, he overlooked a crucial fact. American industry quite literally depends on it. U.S. refineries are engineered for Canadian heavy crude. Without it, they cannot operate efficiently, and no combination of American light crude or imports from Mexico and Venezuela can fill the gap. This year alone, Canada has supplied well over 2/3 of America's crude imports, a structural necessity, not a luxury. The same applies to aluminum. The United States does not produce enough for aerospace, defense, or large-scale manufacturing. Canadian aluminum remains the backbone of several American sectors, which is why the tariff spikes earlier this year caused turmoil not in Ottawa, but in U.S. factories. And in the new economy, EVs, batteries, chips, electrification, the dependency grows even sharper. Canada holds some of the most important critical mineral reserves in the Western world. Without Canadian nickel, copper, cobalt, and the infrastructure that transports them, the U.S. cannot meet its own energy transition targets. Major American automakers know this. GM, Ford, and Tesla all rely on Canadian components, Canadian materials, and Canadian energy. The White House may speak casually, but corporate America understands the supply chain math. So when Trump claims the U.S. doesn't need what Canada produces, it doesn't weaken Canada, it weakens the credibility of American trade policy. Trump's pivot from trade to hockey sounded harmless, but it revealed a deeper misreading of today's Canada. This is not a country defined by ice rinks. This is a country reshaping its industrial footprint and its geopolitical role simultaneously. Canada is in advanced talks with South Korea on submarine procurement, a move that would significantly expand its Arctic and Pacific capabilities. Nova Scotia is preparing one of the world's most ambitious offshore wind developments, a 66-gigawatt blueprint that could transform the entire eastern grid. British Columbia's North Coast transmission line is unlocking the Copper Belt, drawing global mining investment into a region that will define the next generation of electrification. And across Asia and Europe, Canada is building commercial relationships that dilute U.S. tariff risk and give Canadian exporters a wider stage. This is not the Canada of a decade ago. This is a Canada that stands as a middle power with real leverage, diplomatic, industrial, and strategic. Carney's government has leaned into that transformation. With the U.S. drifting through tariff politics and internal lawsuits, Canada has filled the vacuum with competence and direction. The contrast is impossible to ignore.
This shift represents a broader redefinition of Canada's place in the world. No longer content to be viewed as America's quieter northern neighbor, Canada is asserting itself as a middle power with reach, leverage, and strategic assets that matter far beyond North America. And in doing so, Canada is proving that influence in the 21st century is built not through bluster, but through stability, predictability, and smart alliances. Trump's brief remarks at the Kennedy Center revealed more than he intended. His uncertainty, his misreading of supply chains, and his casual dismissal of a key ally underscore a fundamental shift in North America's balance of power. Canada is not waiting for Trump to restart negotiations. Canada is building a world where it doesn't need to. The United States can choose to re-engage seriously, or it can continue improvising. But the era when Washington dictated the terms is fading fast. Canada now has partners across the Pacific, industrial anchors across Europe, and energy projects at home that will reshape its economy for decades. So the closing question is simple. If Trump's answer is still "we'll see," then what exactly is the U.S. waiting for? Because Canada stopped waiting a long time ago. Canada has been shifting aluminum exports to non-U.S. markets, and that single move has just exposed the biggest flaw in Donald Trump's tariff strategy.
So we had to revert to ship to Europe temporarily over the summer because the transactional price for aluminium was not factoring in the total cost of the tariff. It took some weeks, and finally it has reached a threshold where metal is attracted back into North America, which means that more and more through the coming weeks and months, the end user, the consumer, will be hit by the full impact of the tariff, which will become more and more unsustainable, disruptive, and potentially create some inflationary pushback in the U.S.
When Trump slammed a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum this summer, Washington expected Ottawa to fold. Instead, Canada calmly redirected nearly half of its aluminum flow to Europe, avoided massive financial losses, and forced the United States to confront the true cost of its own protectionism. As Canada pivoted outward, North America's supposedly integrated supply chain began to crack. U.S. manufacturers faced higher costs, consumers absorbed rising prices, and the political narrative Trump tried to control slipped away. Months later, Canadian aluminum is flowing back into the U.S. market, but only because Americans finally accepted a permanently higher price tag. What Trump intended as punishment has now evolved into a textbook example of how Canada adapts, survives, and ultimately gains leverage in a global economy increasingly shaped by strategic resilience.
The situation with a 50% tariff is highly disruptive for an integrated value chain, industrial value chain like we have in North America. So we were basically losing money shipping to the U.S. We lost about $600 million over a matter of weeks, which brought Canada, the Canadian producers, to ship or to avoid shipping about 45% of the metal that normally goes to the U.S., keeping some in Canada and shipping some to Europe.
In June 2025, the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian aluminum to 50% under its revived America First industrial strategy. The White House framed the measure as economic self-defense, insisting that Canada was flooding the U.S. with cheap metal. But aluminum isn't optional for American industry. It is an essential input for cars, packaging, aviation, construction, and clean energy systems. And the reality is embarrassingly simple. The U.S. cannot meet its aluminum demand without Canada. When the tariff hit, Canadian producers immediately faced the risk of losing hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of weeks. They made the rational choice: stop shipping to a distorted market. Roughly 45% of Canada's usual aluminum exports to the United States were pulled back. Some of that metal remained inside Canada, but a significant portion moved to Europe, where long-established commercial relationships made the transition smooth. Canada avoided immense losses, protected full production capacity, and preserved stability in its industry. Throughout the summer, the U.S. market slowly adjusted to the tariff. Prices climbed. manufacturers complained, and only once American buyers began absorbing the true cost of Trump's decision did Canadian aluminum start returning to the United States, this time at a higher price, with consumers footing the bill.
This aluminum pivot tells a larger story about political power, economic strategy, and the limits of American protectionism in 2025. The first lesson is that Canada has options, far more than Trump expected. His team assumed Canada had no alternative market and would be forced to sell into the United States at a loss. That was wrong. Canadian smelters are overwhelmingly located near the coast, meaning they can load ships and reach Europe, Asia, or South America without friction. Canadian companies already have deep footprints in Iceland, Norway, and other European regions, allowing them to redirect production almost instantly. When the U.S. closed its door, the global market opened another. Europe absorbed nearly double its usual volume of Canadian aluminum during the summer months, confirming that Canada is not trapped in a North American bubble. The tariff accelerated diversification, and Canada became stronger because of it. The second lesson is that Trump broke the very supply chain he claimed he was protecting. For decades, North America operated under an unwritten agreement. Canada produced clean, stable, reliable aluminum, and the United States consumed it. Trump shattered that balance overnight. Industry leaders on both sides of the border warned that a 50% tariff was unsustainable for an integrated industrial system. They were right. U.S. producers of cars, beverage cans, aircraft components, and infrastructure materials suddenly faced higher input costs. Those expenses cascaded through the supply chain, ultimately landing in consumer prices. In a political moment where U.S. inflation is already sensitive, Trump's tariff became an additional tax on American families. The third lesson is about leverage, and it may be the most uncomfortable truth for Washington. The aluminum dispute exposed something Trump never admits. The U.S. needs Canada far more than Canada needs the U.S. America simply does not have enough domestic aluminum capacity to replace Canadian supply. Turning to other foreign suppliers is complicated. Some involve geopolitical concerns, sanctions, or unstable markets. Canadian aluminum, meanwhile, is produced with hydroelectric power and meets the highest environmental standards in the world. It is exactly the kind of metal U.S. manufacturers want: clean, consistent, and reliable. When Canada withdrew almost half of its supply, U.S. buyers had only two choices: pay more or risk shortages. They chose to pay more. That is not a show of strength from the United States. It is a demonstration of Canadian leverage. And while the U.S. was scrambling to patch the gaps, Canada's confidence only grew. Ottawa recognized that diversification wasn't just a defensive move, it was a strategic upgrade. By opening wider channels to Europe and reinforcing ties across the Indo-Pacific, Canada reduced its exposure to U.S. volatility. In other words, Trump's tariff didn't isolate Canada, it pushed Canada to become even more globally connected. There is also a political reality unfolding in Washington. Trump's trade agenda is now being criticized not only by Democrats, but by American businesses that once supported him. The aluminum tariff added new pressure to an economy already strained by wider tariff battles with China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe. Every new tariff raises costs somewhere else in the economy. Trump claims this is part of a long-term industrial revival, but to ordinary Americans, it looks like rising prices, shrinking competition, and confusion over why their country keeps picking fights that weaken its own supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, responded with discipline. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the approach was not combative theatrics, but strategic repositioning. Ottawa allowed the market to do its work. Producers were given the freedom to redirect exports. Diplomatic channels stayed open. Canada avoided the emotional escalation that Trump often relies on. And in the end, Canada emerged as the more stable, more predictable, and more globally connected economy. The aluminum pivot also reinforces a broader trend in 2025. Canada is becoming the calm anchor in a turbulent global landscape. Investors see it, manufacturers see it, and even American companies now recognize that Canada remains one of the world's most reliable industrial partners, even if their own government treats us like a target rather than an ally.
The aluminum tariff was supposed to be Trump's demonstration of strength. Instead, it exposed the vulnerability of America's industrial system and the resilience of Canada's. Canada avoided the economic hit Trump intended, expanded its global connections, strengthened its market position, and ultimately sold its aluminum back to the United States, but only once Americans accepted the higher cost. This dispute leaves a clear and unavoidable question: if a single tariff can fracture North America's supply chain and push U.S. prices higher, what happens when Trump's next round of protectionism arrives? Because one thing is now certain: Canada can adapt, Canada can pivot, Canada can find new markets. The real instability is coming from the South, and the world is beginning to notice.